The post office door shut behind her with a sound like a verdict. Meg stood on the boardwalk in Dunmore, British Columbia, with $32 in her coat pocket, and nowhere left to be. The sky above the Rockies had gone the color of old pewter, and the wind coming down from the pass smelled like iron and snow. She'd been standing there long enough that her fingers had stopped hurting and started going numb, which she understood from a winter spent in Dawson City years ago was the worse of the two options. The letter she'd just received was still in her hand. She didn't need to read it again. 3 sentences, her uncle's property. The only address she'd been able to give anyone in 6 months had been sold to pay his debts, effective the 15th. Today was the 17th. She'd come to Dunmore because it was the last place on the map before the road turned to gravel and the gravel turned to nothing. She'd come because there was a logging outfitter here who'd posted a notice in Kelowna about seasonal cooking work, and because she had no other notice to follow. She'd come because the alternative was to stay in Kelowna and keep sleeping on Denise's couch and watching Denise's husband look at her like she was a problem that hadn't been solved yet. The outfitter's office had a sign on the door. Closed for the season. Back in April. It was October. Meg folded the letter and put it in her pocket with the $32 and stood on the boardwalk and thought, with a calm that surprised her, that she had made every correct decision and arrived at the worst possible place anyway. There was something almost funny about that. She didn't laugh. The town of Dunmore was 4 blocks of buildings and a gas station and a diner called Patrice's that had a cardboard open sign hanging crooked in the window. Meg picked up her pack, 40 litres, everything she owned that mattered, and walked toward it because it was warm inside, and she still had $32, and she needed to think. She ordered coffee and a bowl of soup and took the booth farthest from the door. The woman behind the counter, heavy-set, with grey-streaked hair, pulled back in a braid, brought the soup without being asked twice, and didn't hover, which Meg appreciated. The diner smelled like fry oil and coffee grounds, and the particular dusty warmth of a building that has been heating itself for decades. There were 2 other people in the place. An old man at the counter, reading a newspaper, and a man in the far corner booth who had his back to the room. Meg didn't pay him much attention at first. She was doing the arithmetic that had become her primary occupation over the past 4 months. What she had, what she owed, how many days she could stretch it. $32, minus the soup and coffee, left her with just under 28. She had a sleeping bag, rated to -15. She had a tarp. She had a utility knife and a headlamp, and approximately 4 days of dried food. She had done harder things than sleep in October in the mountains, though not recently, and not alone. The old man at the counter paid his bill and left. The bell above the door rang and a gust of cold came in with him, and then was sealed out again. It was then she heard the woman at the counter, Patrice, presumably, speak to the man in the corner booth. Not what she said, just the tone of it, the particular careful tone people used with someone they weren't sure about. Meg looked up. He was big. That was the first thing, and it wasn't a minor observation. He took up most of the booth on his own, shoulders like something load-bearing, hands around a mug that looked small in his grip. He wore a canvas work jacket the color of dried moss, and his dark hair was overlong, pushing past his collar. He had the kind of beard that came from not caring about it rather than cultivating it. He was looking at the counterwoman with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was not warm either. It was simply direct, the way animals are direct, without performance in either direction. He said something, and Patrice nodded and went to get whatever he'd asked for. He didn't look at Meg. He looked out the window at the street, which was empty now, the light fading fast the way it did in October in the mountains, like someone pulling a shade. She looked away, ate her soup. It was good soup, barley and root vegetables, the kind that had been going for hours. She ate slowly because she didn't know when she'd eat next, and because there was no reason to hurry. She was on her second cup of coffee, reading the community board by the door, when the man in the corner paid and stood. She registered this peripherally. He was even larger standing up. He pulled on a heavy coat, not the canvas jacket, something heavier, oilskin maybe, and picked up a paper bag from the seat beside him, provisions from the look of it, and walked to the door. He stopped. Meg realized he was looking at her pack, which was propped against the wall beside the booth. The external frame, the tarp bunged to the bottom, the way it was packed. He looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize. Then he looked at her. His eyes were dark and level, and he did not look away. When she met them, which most people did. "Roads closing tomorrow," he said. "Storm coming down from the Yukon." She hadn't known that. "Thanks," she said. He nodded, pushed through the door. The bell rang. Meg sat for another moment and then looked at Patrice. "Is there a hostel here? Or a shelter?" Patrice set down the coffee pot. "There was. Closed 3 years ago. There's a motel outside town on the highway, but the road up there is already iced." She paused. "You looking for work?" "I was. The outfitter's closed." Patrice made a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. "He does that. Closes 2 weeks before he says he will." She picked up a cloth and wiped the counter. "You have somewhere to stay tonight?" Meg said. "I'll figure something out," which was what she always said, and which was sometimes true. Outside the window she could see the man. He was loading his provisions into the back of a truck, an old Dodge, blue once, the paint worn to primer in patches. He moved efficiently in the cold, not hurrying, not wasting anything either. She watched him tie the tarp down over the truck bed. He knew what he was doing with rope. "Who is he?" she asked. Patrice glanced out. "Asa Covell. He's got a place up Fallow Creek, about 14 kilometers up the fire road." She paused again, with the particular pause of someone choosing what to add. "He's all right. He keeps to himself." "Does he come into town often?" "Once a month, maybe. Gets supplies. Doesn't stay long." Patrice folded the cloth. "He used to come in more. After his wife passed, he stopped." Meg filed this away without knowing why. Outside, the truck started. She could hear the engine from inside. A diesel, well maintained. The headlights came on, and then, instead of pulling out onto the road, the truck sat idling. She picked up her pack. She told herself she was going outside, because she needed to assess the weather. This was partially true. The sky to the north had taken on the flat white look she associated with incoming snow, and the wind had picked up, and there was that smell again. Iron and cold. It would snow before morning, maybe before dark. She stood on the boardwalk, and the truck was still there, engine running. The driver's window came down. Asa Covell looked at her, then at the pack on her shoulder. "Fire Road'll be closed after tonight," he said. "I won't be back down for 6 weeks, maybe 8. She wasn't sure what he was telling her. "I'm not going to be able to offer you much," he said. "I've got a spare room. It's a storeroom, really. But it's dry and it's warm." He paused. "I don't know your situation." "I don't know yours," Meg said. He took that without expression. "Fair enough." She stood there in the cold thinking about it. $28. A sleeping bag rated to -15. October in the Rockies. She thought about what she knew about this man, which was, he tied tarps correctly, he had dark eyes that didn't flinch, he had lost his wife, and Patrice, who had the manner of a woman who had lived in this town long enough to know everything about everyone, had said he was all right. She had made worse decisions based on less. "I can cook," she said, "and I know how to work." Something shifted in his expression, though it wasn't quite a smile. "Get in then," he said. The fire road was exactly what it sounded like. 14 kilometers of gravel track cut into the mountainside, narrow enough, in places, that the spruce branches scraped the roof of the truck. Asa drove it without turning on the high beams, which told her he knew every curve of it. The headlights threw pale columns into the dark, and the first flakes of snow were beginning to hit the windshield. He didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, and she didn't either. There was a thermos in the cup holder between them, and he gestured at it, without looking away from the road. She poured a cup, coffee, black, still hot, and held it with both hands and watched the trees close in around them. "You can leave whenever the road clears," he said finally. "Spring, probably. I'm not asking you to stay. I understand. I'm not asking why you're here, either." She looked at him. His eyes were on the road. "Okay," she said. "People usually want to know things," he said. It wasn't a complaint, more like a statement of fact about a phenomenon he found mildly interesting. "I'm not in a position to be curious," Meg said. Another long silence. Comfortable, somehow, or at least not uncomfortable, which at this point felt like the same thing. "What kind of cooking?" he asked. "I worked in a camp kitchen in the Yukon for 2 seasons. Before that, I did a stint at a backcountry lodge on Vancouver Island." She paused. "I can make anything work with what's available." "That's useful," he said. She couldn't tell if he meant it as a compliment or just as an assessment, the way you'd assess a tool for whether it would do the job. The trees opened up. The cabin was built into the hillside, low and long, with a covered porch running the full length of the front. There was a woodshed attached on the south end, its roof heavy already with early snow. A barn, maybe 30 meters back. She could see the shape of it, and hear faintly something moving inside. "You've got animals," she said. "2 horses. A pair of sled dogs." He turned off the engine and sat for a moment. "I'll deal with them before we go in." She noticed this. She said nothing about it, but she noticed it. He took the provisions from the truck bed, and she reached for her share without asking, and he let her take it. They carried the bags to the porch and set them down, and then he went to the barn. She waited on the porch. She could hear him talking to the horses inside, low. Even sounds, not words she could make out, just the tone of someone checking in. It took maybe 15 minutes. When he came back, he smelled of hay and horse and the cold. He held the door for her, but didn't make a production of it. Inside was smaller than the outside suggested, but not cramped. There was a main room with a wood stove at its center. Not lit yet, the ash from the morning's fire still grey in the pan. A table made from a single wide plank, 2 chairs, and shelves along every wall lined with labeled jars and cans and paperbacks with broken spines. A kitchen along the back wall, a narrow hallway. He crouched at the wood stove and had a fire going in under 3 minutes. She didn't watch him do it because she didn't want him to feel watched. She unpacked the provisions instead, sorting them onto the kitchen counter by type, the way she'd been taught in the camp kitchen. Dry goods, refrigeratables, perishables first. When he stood and turned, he looked at what she'd done, and then at her. "The cold room is through that door," he said, pointing. "It stays around 4 degrees in there, all right. There are potatoes in there, carrots, turnips, cabbage, dried beans in the second jar from the left on the shelf." He looked at the window. The snow was coming harder now, the flakes big and purposeful. "Beans take overnight to soak." "I know," she said. Something crossed his face. Not amusement quite, but close. He showed her the spare room. It was indeed a storeroom, maybe 8 feet by 10, a single window facing north, shelves along one wall now partially cleared, a cot along the other with a wool blanket and a pillow. There was a hook on the back of the door. "It's warm," she said, because it was. The stove's heat reached here. "I'll knock before I come in," he said. "Thank you." He left her there. She set her pack on the end of the cot and sat down beside it and put her hands on her knees and breathed. Outside the window, the snow was coming down in earnest now. She could hear the stove cracking as it warmed up and the dogs shifting in the barn. And somewhere above the cabin, the wind finding the ridge, she thought. "I am in a stranger's house on a mountain in October. And I don't know anything about this man except that he remembered to take care of his horses before he took off his coat." She decided that was enough. For tonight, it was enough. The weeks settled into a shape she hadn't expected. Asa was up before her, which she discovered on the second morning, and then accepted as fact. By the time she came out of the storeroom each day, the stove was burning, and there was water heated for coffee, and he was either outside or sitting at the table with a topographic map and a pencil, making notes in the margins. He marked locations on the maps in a small, precise hand, game corridors, she eventually understood, and water sources, and places where the ridge broke and became something impassable. He was a trapper, and he guided elk hunters in the fall, and in the deep winter he cut firewood and sold it in town in the spring. He had a contract with a forestry company to report on certain sections of the watershed. He was not romantic about the mountains. He worked them the way a mechanic works an engine, with knowledge and respect, neither sentimentality nor resentment. She cooked. She kept the stove fed when he was out. She chopped what needed chopping and repaired what she could find to repair, and when she ran out of things that needed doing, she read the paperbacks on his shelves, which ran to Jack London, Patrick Lane, Alice Munro, one incongruous copy of Moby Dick with a library stamp from a school in Lethbridge. She asked him once, across the table over dinner, where he'd grown up. "Alberta," he said, "what brought you here?" He turned his fork over in his hand. "I needed somewhere that didn't need explaining." She thought about that. "Did you find it close enough?" he said. He was not a man who filled silence, but he was not uncomfortable in her presence, which she understood was its own kind of communication. Some people cannot tolerate another person in a room without making noise, filling it up, covering the space. Asa Covell simply existed in the same space she did, like a large and quiet animal that had assessed her and found her non-threatening. She found she liked it, the quiet. She had not known she needed it until she was in it. There was the night in the third week when she woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of one of the dogs barking. Once, twice, then silence. She lay still and heard Asa's boots on the floor, then the outer door, then nothing. She pulled on her coat over her clothes and went to the window and saw the beam of his headlamp moving. Toward the barn, she put water on to boil. By the time he came back inside, his hands were cold enough that she could see it in the way he held them, and she poured a mug without being asked and set it on the table. He sat down. "Mare was spooked," he said. "Something on the ridge, probably a wolverine." He wrapped both hands around the mug. "She's all right." "Good," Meg said. They sat like that for a while, in the kitchen with the stove going and the snow ticking against the glass, not saying anything, and it was the most at ease she'd felt in a long time. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She hadn't noticed it arriving. The hard part came in the 4th week. She'd known something was pressing on him. She'd felt it the way you feel. A change in weather, not seeing it yet, but feeling it in your body, in the air. He'd been quieter than usual, if that was possible. He came in from his trap line later. He ate without tasting anything, which she could tell by the way his eyes stayed on the middle distance. On a Tuesday, he came in at dusk and stood at the kitchen door in his snow boots and said, "My wife died 4 years ago this week." Meg turned from the stove. She didn't say she was sorry, because he wasn't asking for that. She liked this week, he said. She said the light was different in October. She had theories about it. He paused. She had theories about a lot of things. "What was her name?" Meg asked. "Ruth." "She sounds like she was curious," Meg said. Something moved in his face. She was. About everything. He looked at the floor and then out the window. "She would have liked you, I think. You don't waste words." He said it simply, like a fact, like pointing at a feature on a map. Meg didn't say anything. She turned back to the stove. He took off his boots and hung his coat and sat down at the table, and she put a plate in front of him, and he ate. When he was done, he said, "Thank you," and she understood he didn't just mean for the food. After that, the week passed with a different weight to it, but it passed. She'd learned that grief could be sat with the same way everything else could be sat with. If you didn't demand it explain itself. She'd intended to leave when the road cleared. She knew this because she reminded herself of it regularly, with the particular diligence of someone who suspects they might forget if they stop reminding. In April, she thought, When the pass opens, she'd go back to Kelowna, or maybe Victoria, or maybe north again. There was always work north. She was sorting the last of the winter stores one morning, in late March, when she found, at the back of the cold room shelf, a jar of preserved blueberries with a handwritten label. The handwriting was not Asa's. She held it in both hands for a moment, and then set it back exactly where she'd found it, and didn't mention it. The road cleared on the 14th of April. She knew because the sound of the melt changed. The creek that ran below the cabin went from a low mutter to something urgent and full, and the birch on the south slope put out their first pale leaves. And on the morning of the 14th, Asa came in from outside and said, "Road's passable." Meg stood at the sink, washing the breakfast dishes. "I know," she said. "I heard it this morning." He poured himself coffee and sat at the table. She could feel him there behind her the way you can feel a fire, not touching it, just aware of the warmth. "I'll drive you down when you're ready," he said. "Okay," she said. She finished the dishes, dried them and put them away, each in its place, wiped down the counter. The stove was burning low and she fed it 2 pieces of birch and adjusted the damper. She went to the storeroom and looked at her pack on the end of the cot. The 40 litres of everything that mattered. She'd repacked it twice over winter when she was restless, the way you reread a letter you already know by heart. She stood there a long time. When she came back to the main room, Asa was still at the table. He had his hands around his mug, and he was looking at the window, at the birch trees with their new leaves, pale green and trembling. He didn't look at her. "There's work here," he said, "if you wanted it. Proper work. The forestry contract comes with a second permit this year. I could use someone who can navigate and document." He paused. "I'm not asking you to stay." "You said that in October," Meg said. "It was true then, too." He turned his mug slowly in his hands. "I'm just telling you there's a reason to, if you wanted one." She sat down in the other chair. The one that had been there when she arrived, but that she'd been using for 6 months now, enough that she thought of it, absurdly, as hers. Outside the creek was loud with snowmelt, and the birch leaves shook in the mountain wind, and somewhere above the ridge a raven called once, twice, and was quiet. "What does the work pay?" she asked. He told her. It was enough. "I'll need to go to Dunmore at some point," she said. "I'm out of a few things." "I can drive you Thursday," he said. "All right." He nodded. He picked up his mug. He looked back at the window. She thought about Ruth's jar of blueberries on the shelf. She thought about the topographic maps with their small, precise notations. She thought about a man who checked on his horses before he took off his coat, who knocked before he opened a door, who spoke his grief plainly, without demanding anything in return for it. She thought, there are worse things than a reason to stay. She got up and went to the kitchen and put more water on to boil, and the stove crackled and the creek ran on outside, and neither of them said anything more, because nothing more needed to be said.